After my first collection, Woodsmoke, which was quite an introspective book, I was looking to write poems about subjects outside of myself, and the idea was to rediscover the world through poetry. I remember wanting to be surprised about what I might find, and my only guide was not to use the words I or me. I succeeded for about 20 poems or so. I began writing about birds and animals, odes and elegies, places within the world and within the mind. Throughout the journey of the book, I was continually finding myself writing poems, engaging with poets who have influenced my own poetry. Towards the end of the book, I felt I had some unfinished business from Woodsmoke I needed to address. Thorn is divided in 4 parts, and although written at the end, the more personal poems appear in the first part of the book. The second part is largely focused on the natural world, while the third concentrates on odes and elegies, those conversations with influential poets, and of course the odd obscurity. The fourth and final part are poems about place and my relationship to certain places within the world.
I've just come in from attending to 3 different kinds of beans that I've raised from seed, and now the 3rd thunderstorm cell in 3 days is threatening to wipe them out. This is what I've been doing in a lock of time down, growing things and writing poetry. And it's the writing of poetry that leads me to say what a great pleasure it is to launch Todd Turner's wonderful new book, Thorn. I've given this launch speech a name. I've called it Under the Surface Like a Clue, which is from the poem Heirloom. And that's because so many of the poems in this terrific book reveal the details slowly from under the taut meniscus of the lines. The clues emerge by stages. Rarely is anything ever completely given away without the teasing work of metaphor and judicious use of simile. So, from the first poem in Todd's second collection, Thorn, it's evident that he's maintained the rich lyrical focus that informed the poetry in Woodsmoke, his first book. Here's a line from the title poem. It plumes from the fire's red hearth, sends up its flag of stored aeons and multifarious resins in a surly blue-charred glaze. I'd like to say a couple of things about that brief return to earlier work. One is that it's an ensign to Todd's ability to bring variousness into sharp focus and make it cohere. And second, it's a reminder of what a brilliant ear this poet has. This is something that can't be taught, only encouraged and refined by wide reading and years of serious practice, and more wide reading. Unless, of course, you're cut from the same cloth as Arthur Rimbaud and run guns and hashish across borders while dashing off poems to die for. It's not just the almost palpable dance of vowels and consonants that inform those 4 lines. It's the breaking of bread with the line to make a visual and oral sense of otherness that gives these poems their spell-like resonance. The same potency of language and control of rhythm and image can be seen in abundance throughout Thorn. I first read the book on another stormy day, starting early before my body clock kicked in and the afternoon rugby league match was looming. Reading a book from cover to cover is an important thing for reviewers and launchers of books of poems, as it gives that initial external and concomitant subliminal hit that puts a taproot into the head and the skin. It's impossible to read a book like Thorn right through and not have issues pertaining to influence, subject matter, and the inimitable sound that some poets develop early on and maintain. My next readings involve taking notes and reading back and forth, randomly and then again sequentially. What surfaced quickly was the authority with which Todd has shaped and given these poems their final forms. Influence, too, while sometimes being obvious in certain poets' works, can also be a contentious, if not wayward, attempt to define that link between reading and writing, history and shared stamp of insight. Here's a taste from the last two lines of the opening poem, Thread. The breathless becoming of a word that draws on its implicit shape. This has the ghost print, not the watermark of Wallace Stevens inside it. Stevens's influence can be felt in a number of the poems here, but rather than be overt, the echoes are subtle and become one with the surrounding music rather than rise above it. This is not something a poet does consciously. It happens during the ebb and flow of surrender to the imagination and the conducting of an alert, objective reckoning with the lines during the drafting process. When Todd summons the past, as he does often here, he does so with emotion memory, not just recall. Eliot's objective correlative is in harness, first in the lengthy sequence My Middle Name, where absence, silence and melancholy prepare the ground for portraits of the poet's parents and maternal grandfather, with his habit of pain and shouts of debt and betrayal. The external dovetailed with the internal to create a meaningful emotional impression on the reader. There's also an abundance of evidence that speaks to the poetic impulse and how this poet cultivates imagery and compelling rhythms from what's been returned from the outside world. A glance, a word, a strand of music. The titles of these poems across 4 sections give some idea of what's in store. Much of it, on the surface at least, to do with birds, animals and the natural world in general, and many have one-word titles. But Todd Turner is not a poet to be drawn into tight negotiations over themes. He understands Richard Hugo's statement that subject matter must always be placed into the service of language, as to put language to work in the sweatshops of subject matter is to risk having a poem with limited dimensions and nuance. The poem Dolls begins with the poet's mother's doll collection. So far, so obvious. But the poem quickly deepens into a metaphor for clear observation in a time of stillness, much like the time we're in right now, in many ways, and folds away into elegy, a love letter of future finance hidden under dolls. It's a masterful poem. Part 2 of Thorn begins with Magpies, a narrow poem composed of tercets, each loaded with lyrical tension, and line breaks are just right. There can only be room for one magpie poem whose refrain nails the warble, quarter-loodle-ardle wardle-doodle, Dennis Glover's The Magpies, but Todd Turner's poem is a musical exacting homage to the denizens of our territorial, piebald swoopers and singers. Every word is clipped into place and polished to a gleam. Villanelle for a calf recalls the voice and rural laconic authority of Philip Hodgins. The rhyme scheme and refrain of the form seem perfectly suited to the subject matter, a branding with a fire iron on a calf. As with the Hodgins line, each time the gravel slid off the end of the shovel in shooting the dogs, so I can still remember the sound, and I turn my eyes toward the ground in Todd's poem remain as indelible insights into aspects of rural life that remain unpalatable. I spoke with Todd at length a couple of months ago. We read each other new poems. We discussed our favourite poets. I'd always sensed that Todd reads widely, yet I had no idea of just how voracious his reading habits are or how extensive his knowledge of contemporary poets. It's clear that Todd favours reading British poets over the Americans, yet I do know of his love for Philip Levine, James Wright and James Dickey. It's no accident that the work of those poets is also often similar in tone and intensity to the work of the Brits, Kathleen Jamie, Ted Hughes, Douglas Dunn, and the American import into Britain, the late, great Michael Donaghy. I'm delighted to launch Thorn. It's a vital book of poems and one that will further strengthen Todd's position as an emerging major Australian poet. I've decided not to read any poems from Thorn. That really is the domain for Todd himself, and I very much look forward to hearing and watching him read.
Hello, I'm Todd Turner. Thank you for joining me for the launch of my second collection of poetry, Thorn, which was released early this year through Puncher and Watman. Like so many other authors who have had their launches cancelled due to COVID, I was looking to find a way to celebrate the book's release. I had a conversation with a graphic designer and video artist, Carl Ryman, about the idea of creating videos to accompany recordings of the poems. I kind of hoped the videos for the poems would be a bit like video clips for songs. So I spoke to a number of poets about the idea, some whom I knew and some I didn't, and to my surprise, those I asked were interested in the project. So each poet chose a poem or two from the collection, and each made recordings of their readings, and then Carl and I went about collecting images which could work with all the imagery within the chosen poems. So as part of the launch, the videos and recordings will be aired for the first time. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the poets who contributed their recordings. They are Stephen Edgar, Judith Beveridge, David Musgrave, Simon West, Jordie Albiston and Jaya Savige. I'd also like to pay a special thanks to Anthony Lawrence for his launch speech, to David Musgrave for believing in the manuscript, and Puncher and Watman for publishing the book. And again to David Musgrave, Judith Beveridge, Stephen Edgar, and also Robert Gray for their editorial feedback on the poems. I also need to thank a few others. Emma Fielden for her dedicated support throughout the writing of the book, to Carl Ryman for the extensive work on the videos, and to Guy Maestri for generously allowing me to use his painting Wreck No. 4 for the cover image. I want to thank my family, particularly my daughter Alana, for whom the book is dedicated. For those interested, I hope you enjoy the book. Thank you for joining me in celebrating the launch. Please enjoy the videos.
Road to Lama Sierra. It is good to be on the patched and potholed road among the diesel cowboys, toxic utes and earth-churned air. Here everything's rich with intention, or at ease with the lack of it. Car lot farmyards loaded with Bedford trucks and block-bound F-100s, weed-fringed shipping containers and sunken caravans rusting with gypsy dreams. Cluttered in jumble and strewn with scrap for the tip, The whole place brims with a collective shrug. Loose-fenced paddocks, trailers, boats and corrugated tin lie side by side, and like a troop of the nonchalant, the locals fish out of dams under beach umbrellas, while a herd of cows stand up to their teats, cooling in tea-coloured water. Wherever you look, sprawling flat vistas are dotted with ramshackle sheds, chicken farms and quasi-palatial brickyard homes. Look, here comes the big chook, and here come those Corinthian pillars, larger than the history of Greece. Droll and bewildering, palm trees and cactus plants add a certain continental colour to the roadside. You could say it's all hotchpotch and mutton stew, a Mediterranean Texas among the gums. Goats and llamas, bedizened with flies, are herded within a trove of worn-out tyres, metal debris and Florentine statuettes. The mix of warmth and neglect has their teeth, glinting yellow in the sun. In this Eden of fountains and phony flamingos, a lame horse drinks from the troughs of replenished cloud. On hillocks of backhoed dirt, somnolent birds roost and flutter up, sifting the earth. They peck at the roasted sprouts of wildflower and sun-fed weed, dig into whatever else has taken root through the drifts of heat and hothouse rain.
The Juggler. Beneath the perpetual orbit of spinning worlds, haphazardly balanced upon the east-west axis of a rocking plank, a man juggles a quintet of Earth's most principal form. 5 glittering orbs go up, willing the onlookers awake, as the spinning trajectory arcs and cascades in a formula fit for theorems of geometry, or the mute notation of plotted notes graphed in the minds of those who map them out across the horizontal lines of a stave.
Tent. Pinned down dwelling place. Small abode. Windsock, weathervane, umbrella home, where I lie lodged as the night, lunar bright, comes quickening. I wake and look out through an islet no bigger than a loophole. Earth has turned its cheek to the moons, and the distance blinks with a clot of stars. I reach up and feel for the switch on the hanging lamp. The air brightens with a click, then dims to a tarnished glow. Out in the paddock, all 4 corners of the ground have vanished, and the earth-melded sky glints in a freeze-frame of mica and eon-blasted light. I walk on toward the river under the constellations of spun glitter. The blackened trees and edgeless hills are all but gone from view. I listen to the long, bowed heads of horses ripping fattened tufts from the earth. Their shoes are loose and clackety as they move with an easy gait. Now the moon is above the river, iridescent in its powdery shell, sinking low on the horizon and tiding in ripples downstream. I keep watch, locked to the tumbling current, and imagine the hidden fish coursing in snowmelt and silt. Beneath them, the river drags its stones over and over, dredged and shovelled, along for an age, submersed in a stony elixir. Beyond the slow-rising pools the river meanders, spilling its pebbles and shale. On the banks a cold, thin crust forms over the grass. I hear a crumbling beneath my boot soles. I walk back to the tent as the domed world sleeps. The rain falls. I lie listening to the petering bell of a cricket and cling to its residual note.
My middle name, Part 4. My grandfather never spoke of his father's death. Suicide is a dead farm, a nameless grave. Still, it must have emanated in every gesture of his being. In letters between my mother and her sisters, a 3-word phrase confides, "Don't tell father." Home on the farm, silence was a whip, a tight-lipped line. A taut knot, it could tie anything off. Boundaries, fences, bullocks, dead wood. Out there, what lingered unspoken was word. My grandfather silenced his father away. My mother wanted to rid herself of his habit of pain. They were hollowed by the sound that caged them in distance, and I was born in its name. My middle name, Part 7. Many times I found my mother trying to air the echo of her father's silence. Often alone at the sink in the kitchen, her gloved hands soaked, finning the boil. But it was in the garden, kneeling over weeds and perennials, and always while digging or plying an axe, where she'd spell out the sum of her piece. I listened for a link between the terms which couldn't be buried or bridged, and what I heard was the unbending halves of two truths, one separateness, a father and daughter, together apart in the gulf of their undoing.
When you find yourself in that moment and you're standing on the borderline between what is given and what is gained, think of the object at hand, the hard neutrality and inner spark of the impartial diamond. Think of it as hearthstone in relief, an element whose steely light outweighs the sun, whose opposing dark is the pure measure of tough love. Bring to mind the very image of its hidden flame, the way its obdurate force is concealed within, how the wick of its enduring fires, locked in like an ember, is the one shining constant at the core. Only when the rough grain is made of inexorable grit do bright colours blaze in the afterglow.
Easily mistaken as unearthly, yet far more grounded than otherworldly, poised and counterpoised on two taut limbs, strolling the parks, perusing the suburban networks of roads and neighbouring reserves, going about things like sentinels, overseers, composed and unperturbed in befitting vestures of black and white. Each with 3 toes forward and 1 toe back, walking with wings tucked in at the hip, stopping on lawns, chattering in burble, prodding and digging the earth for embedded worms, or else breaking the high summer air with lo-fi warbles, wood-piped notes, balancing rhyme and reason from every high-topped vantage point close to home. Fierce keepers of the nest, stoic guardians of their young, princely and proletarian, they set with purifying logic the clear-cut divisible modes of grey.
The sweet science. From flyweight to heavyweight, pound for pound, it's all ringcraft and range, a duck and weave, stick and move, mind-fest of fractions, millimetres and miles, footworked round after round in the spur-of-the-moment flurry, thrown from sweet feet, sugar-gloved hands, artfully taken, slipped and counted in the dancing margin of degrees, where the art of to be or not to be hit is a waltz of toughing it out upon the canvas, and the four corners of the ring, an empty page, history about to be written, has the high hands, toe-turned Joe Marvellous looking for the slipshod guard, the hoodied kid with blind hunger who spat blood and never knew why, the punch-drunk thug on the loose, contender on the up, promoter on the take, the fox-trotting shaman in love with his shadow, poetic pugilist, testing his fitness for struggle in the chin grit, high stakes, take no prisoners, ladies and gentlemen's game of punch and counter anticipation, of being tagged and rocked but ever pressing forward, where the odds-on bet of stomaching the air being knocked out of you, swallowing the sting on your face, taking it on the chin while channeling the movements of a panther, a March Hare, Roy Jones Jr. or Sugar Ray, is a heightened sense of touch and intuition, tactile sensitivity, a crafty concoction of shots on the inside, the spatial awareness within a shrink-wrapped guard, like the artful dodger slipping the big-hitting old fella who's in it for the dollar. Not the distance, nor the pain and process of drilling techniques in numbing repetition, balancing the hardest blows behind the lines, away from the hook, the haymaker, the low blow, the clinch and the neutral corner, away from the cut man and the crowd, toward the inner fusion of a knowing combo, a minor-major miracle of self versus self, hardened fortitude, the walk, the talk, coercion into coalescence, practiced precision in the undisputed dance to undergo and overcome.
A ladder. Now can you see the monument? Elizabeth Bishop. Leaning against the wall, this wooden one looks like an archetypal relic. Some of its parts, off-cut or overhang, salvaged from a rooftop, treehouse or a bridge. Yet could there be anything more sound or as singular, more fixed with sequential grace and pure symmetry? Mantle of wood or template of air, trellis and framework of absolutes, foothold that permits you to step beyond the threshold of the here and now, to haul the anchored freight of yourself to a vista of probable clearances. Upwards you climb, rung upon level rung, strung between two landings, though scaling madly into ascension, as if the world were put on hold.